Ready. We read in Parshas Pinchos, portion of Pinchos. Pinchos ben Elozar ben Aaron HaKohen. Pinchos, the son of Elozar, the son of Aaron HaKohen. Normally, whenever the Torah traces one's pedigree, it's only traced one generation. In regard to Pinchos, the Torah traces it to two generations. Pinchos, the son of Elozar, the son of Aaron HaKohen. Aaron was the grandfather. Why are we tracing it back two generations rather than one generation, as it's normally traced? Heshir is chamosi me'al b'nei Yisrael. He had removed my wrath from the b'nei Yisrael, from the Jewish people. How did he remove the wrath? Bekanus kinosi, by avenging my vengeance b'tochem, in their midst. V'lo chilisi, and what was the result of that removal of wrath? If the wrath would have been effect, what would have been? V'lo chilisis b'nei Yisrael b'kinosi, and I did not consume the Jewish people through my vengeance. So Rashi explains, what did Pinchos do? Kino es kinosi. He avenged my vengeance. Benikvol es nikmosi, meaning, bekotzves haketzer shel, the vengeance that I should have expressed, the anger, the wrath which I should have expressed, which would have had untold tragedy, he internalized that vengeance. So because it was displayed through him, it wasn't necessary to be displayed through me. And because he displayed that, therefore, my wrath did not consume and destroy the Jewish people. The Midrash tells us that Zimri, who was the prince of the tribe of Shimon, he had taken Cosbi Basur, who was the Midianite princess, and it was public knowledge that he was cohabiting with her, which is a Torah violation. And because it was public knowledge, it was a public Chil Hashem, desecration of God's name. And he was surrounded in the outer room with all the members, or the inner circle of the tribe of Shimon. That was his tribe. And anybody who dare go in there would be killed. If anybody would try in any way to interfere with what was going on, Pinchas, who was a Levi, the son of Elozar, he takes a spear, puts it up his sleeve, just the blade itself, and the handle, which was a piece of wood, he used as a walking stick. And he walks into this large tent, and they say, by the way, where are you going? He says, I also want to participate in having relations with the daughters of Moab. It was like an orgy in there. So they said, you're welcome to go. He passes the sentries, the guards. He goes in, immediately takes out the blade from his sleeve, attaches it to the handle, which was he used as a walking stick. He takes it, and as they're cohabiting, Zimri and Cosbi, the prince and the Midianite princess, and he pierces them through the genital area, straight through both of them. He goes and he lifts them both up on the spear, and he carries them out of the tent into public view to show exactly what was going on and what kind of disgrace and desecration of God's name this was. And the Midrash tells us there were 12 miracles that had to take place. One of them was Pinchas should have been killed. He was not killed. Anybody who attempted to go into a Pinchas, God sent an angel and killed that person. When he pierced the spear through both of them, to be able to get it through both of them, It's something miraculous. He picked them both up. The weight of two people of this dimension, the spear should have snapped. That he had the strength to lift them. Then, carrying them out, the lintel was too low. Miraculously, the lintel lifted itself. He could go straight out with them. Thirdly, fourthly, fifthly, they should have died. They should have immediately, they were pierced to a degree they should have died through this wound. God kept him alive. So it was a disgrace. Both of them were on the spear, alive, and he carries them out, even to have the strength. Then he slams them to the ground. And at that point, meantime, a plague was ensuing. 24,000 Jews died in this plague because of what happened. And this is when the plague ceased to be. Stopped. So what did Pinchas accomplish through his zealotry? There was an ensuing plague which would have destroyed Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people. Because of his act of zealotry, there was a vengeance which is not to be described. It's a level of anger, intolerable pain that Pinchas cannot tolerate. He could not tolerate this desecration of God's name. And therefore, he went, but it's just his own act of zealotry. It was taught at Sinai that if a Jew cohabits with a non-Jewish woman, and it's public knowledge that they're cohabiting together, kanoim pogimbo, a person who's a true zealot has a right to kill those people who are actually engaged in this act of sexual activity. Pinchas initially, he was seething when he heard and when he saw what was going on. He goes to Moshe and Aaron. He says, "What should I do?" Nisalm and halacha. Moshe had forgotten the law. But Pinchas says to Moshe, "But didn't you teach us at Sinai that Bola Ramis, a man who engages sexually with a non-Jewish woman, Kanoim Pogmo, if you're a Kanoi, if you're a zealot, you have a right to kill those people?" And when he said it to Moshe, Moshe remembered at that moment. So now the question, who would be a better choice to bring about this Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name? Moshe or Pinchas? You would say, would be Moshe Rabbeinu. He is the ultimate Jew. And Pinchas says to Moshe, maybe you should do it, not me. Omalo krainu digart iu levi pervantko. So Moshe says to him, the one who reads the proclamation, he should be the emissary. Since you're the one who remembered it, and I did not, that's the indication that you should carry it out. You are the zealot. Rather, no, you should do it. And this is, immediately, he took the spear, and he went in, and whether he was going to survive at the time, he didn't know whether he would live. He went in to die, for the sake of sanctifying God's name. It was an act. What is a zealot? We find that Avraham Avinu, he was the first human being to come upon the truth of monotheism through his own initiative. He was given a choice: either bow to the idol or go to the kiln. Avraham says, I go into the kiln. I will not live a lie, a falsehood. I prefer to die for the truth. So Nimrod, the king, casts him into this kiln, and he comes out unscathed. Miraculously. That's Avraham Avinu. So, meaning, but don't you say, he had no obligation to give his life. He was a Noahide. He was not a Jew. He could have said, it's under coercion. He's not willingly bowing. He's being forced to bow. But he says, I prefer to die for the truth than live a lie. Avraham Avinu, the founding patriarch of Klal Yisrael, was so committed to the truth. Anything other than living truth to him was death. It's living a living death. I prefer to die for the truth than living a living death. It was something intolerable to him. Pinchas, to see a desecration of God's name to such a degree, the pain was totally all-consuming, subsuming. He could not tolerate the pain. So the whole discussion, but how do you put your life in danger? How do you put your life in jeopardy? At that moment, there is no Pinchas, there is no me, there's no I. It's like a person, as a result of this intolerable pain, he's consumed by the pain. There's no human being, there's no person. That was Pinchas's commitment and love of God. And therefore he acted regardless of what the consequences were. And that's a true kanoi. You could ask a question. It says, Habola Ramis, a person who engages with a non-Jewish woman, if you're a kanoi, if you're a zealot, you have a right to kill that person. You have a right to kill the person. But if we're saying here, if not for the miracle and the miracles that took place, he would have been killed. So if that's the case, what's the point even going? Right? It's true. If you're a zealot, you're permitted to kill the Jew who's cohabiting with the non-Jewish woman. So there you're going to actually carry out an act of what? Of sanctifying God's name by killing the perpetrators. But over here, on a natural level, he wouldn't have made it through the front door. He needed multiple miracles. Pinchas didn't know if the miracles would take place. So if that's the case, this is not an application of Kano and Pogimbo, that a zealot has a right to kill these perpetrators. He would never made it to conclude the action. So how do we understand it? But that's exactly what it's about. A person who's a true kanoi, a zealot, is a person who's consumed where there is no, he didn't think about his life. He has an obligation to avenge God's honor. That's his obligation. And he's consumed by this. Does he think about dying? It's not part of the equation. If he thinks about dying, that means he really hasn't met the grade of being that zealot. So therefore, in his mind, I will stop this desecration of God's name. Because he was there at that level, God performed these miracles for him. And factually, he did stop it. And he saved the day for the Jewish people. Now the question is, what was the liability to the Jewish people? This group of people, they desecrate God's name. The Jews, we're talking about millions of people. God says, I would have destroyed the people because of this public desecration of God's name. What is their level of liability? Why are they culpable? What did they do wrong? Why is there a claim against them? The question is, seeing such a desecration of God's name, such a crime being perpetrated, how do you stand by and remain silent? How do you do such a thing? Evidently, you could live with it. It's not the end of the world. But so the silence itself, you're participating in the desecration of God's name. That's your level of liability. Therefore, you all deserve to be destroyed. It's like a king's honor is being disgraced, and a person's there who could stop it, and he doesn't stop it. That person deserves to be put to death. If you're a true subject of the king, how do you remain silent? The silence seems to you condoning it, and especially could have stopped, which they definitely could. The vast majority of Jews were not part of this. Why don't you stop it? The answer is God is irrelevant. So if God is irrelevant in this context, that means you participated in this desecration of God's name. You all deserve to die. Now, so the chet, the sin was remaining silent, where they could have intervened. The Torah tells us, Pinchas, when he killed these people, it says, Bikinu es kanosi, bekanus bisochom. The act of vengeance took place in their midst. That was by choice. So the Sefarno says, the claim against them was, you remain silent. When they saw the act of Zelda taking place, they also remained silent. That was a correction on the original silence. They could have stopped it. If in any way they give any value to what happened or what's happening, they should immediately pounced on Pinchas and not allowed him to do what he was doing. Why did he allow it to go through? And when he avenged it in their midst, it's only because that itself was an indication that the original silence was what was not as it was perceived to be, although they should have acted, but this is a correction on that original silence. Remaining silent now and not intervening to stop it, that itself is an act of Kiddush Hashem. That's a sanctification of God's name. It's very interesting. We came to Arvas Moav. God made a new covenant with us. It was the covenant called Arevus. Kol Yisrael Arevus Elazeh. All Jews are responsible for one another. It's called communal responsibility. And that liability or that obligation only came about right before Moshe passed away. This is pre that moment. So it's pre that moment. Why should it be liability? Why should we be held liable for what Zimri did, for what his tribe did? But here we find this communal responsibility. It's communal responsibility. Is this a question or not? It's not a question. Why is it not a question? We find, the Sefarno says, by the Chet Egel, how many Jews participated in the golden calf? Relative to the whole number, a handful, a few thousand. But yet God said, if not for Moshe's supplication, I would destroy the Jewish people. Now, what was their liability? What did they do? The rabble instigated it. A small group participated. Yet God says, I will destroy them all. So he explains the same thing. How did they stand by and allow this to happen? How did you allow it? So the silence is the basis for the claim. So what was the correction on that silence? Moshe comes down from Shemayim, from heaven, and he sees what's going on. He says, Mila Shem Elai. The Leviim, the Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, was the smallest tribe. He says, whoever's for God, come with me. And they killed the idolaters. The Jews could have stopped them. Levi, being the smallest tribe, they could have been stopped. But they watched this and they allowed it to take place. They allowed the correction to take place. So allowing the correction to take place was a correction on the original silence when the Egel, when the gold calf was taking place. So over there we also see something similar. Communal responsibility. You're responsible for the few. The answer is that, again, that's not the understanding. We find God says that when the manna will fall, the mon, you're only supposed to keep it until that end of the day. Do not keep it till the morning. There were two Jews, bad Jews. Their names were Dosan and Aviram. They kept it till morning. And what happened? It became putrid, and it rotted, it became wormy. God says, how long are you people going to sin? The whole Jewish people were held accountable for this, for the failing of these two Jews, Dosan and Aviram, who are bad people. Two people sin. Why are all Jews, why are they responsible? Why are they responsible? Again, we're speaking about 40 years before the covenant of Arevus, of communal responsibility. Why are they held responsible? Why are they culpable? Now, the Gemara says that the concept of communal responsibility, which we say, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeluzeh, every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. It means that if a Jew has an obligation to discharge a mitzvah, his obligation, execute a mitzvah and he's not able to do it for himself, I am responsible to make sure that he does it. Because every Jew is responsible for the other Jew. What about if I don't? Then I have liability as if I did the sin. If you see a Jew sinning and you have the power to stop it and you don't, it's as if you sinned. Which sin? The sin that he had done. So Kol Yisrael Arei Muzeh Lozeh goes in the positive and the negative. Because I'm responsible for you, therefore what you do is if I did it. Positive and negative. Here we're talking about something else. If you're a true subject of the king, how could you witness my name being desecrated? If you could have intervened, if you can't intervene, I can't hold you accountable. But if you could have stopped it, what does that say about your level of servitude or subjugation or dedication to God? Nothing. So it's not because I'm responsible for you. That's not the reason why they were held culpable. Over here by Zimri, how could you stand by and watch God's name being desecrated to this degree and remain silent? So that tells us who you are. Not that you're liable for cohabiting with a Gentile. Not that you're held liable because you committed idolatry in the golden calf. But if this itself is a desecration of God's name, how do you stand by and allow God's name to be desecrated? By the month, why did they behave the way they behaved? Because people let them get away with it. There were only two people. They were arrogant. They were evil. They could have had their wings clipped. They could have restrained him. So why didn't you restrain him? The answer is because it's irrelevant. I mean, God's word is irrelevant. That itself is a chil Hashem. To what point am I going to tolerate your misbehavior? You're not behaving properly. So it's not a concept of communal responsibility. It's the concept is your behavior itself, as you're behaving, it's an indication of a disrespect. That's called the desecration of God's name. Therefore, that's the basis for the liability, for the culpability of the Klal Yisrael. This is pre-Arvis Moav, pre-communal, Kol Yisrael Arei Muzeh, that all Jews are responsible for one another. It's a different concept. We find on Purim that it was the third year of the reign of Achashverosh. He was the Persian emperor. He reigned the world supreme. And he makes a banquet. Invites all his countrymen in Shushan. All the people in Shushan, celebrates for 180 days, and invites all the Jews to come. The food that was offered to the Jews was kosher food. The wine was kosher wine. Mordechai says to the Jews, don't go. You should not go. Soon after that, there was an evil man who was a descendant. He was Amalek. His name was Haman. He was the viceroy of the empire. And he convinces Achashverosh that there has to be a decree, lahashmid labra labid, to annihilate every man, woman, and child. And he gets his way. And the decree is given, letters go out to the whole kingdom. At a certain date, every Jewish man, woman, and child will be killed. So the students of Reb Shimon ben Yochai say to him, what did the Jews do so terrible? Where did they fail that they all deserve to be annihilated? That's the question they pose to their Rebbe, Reb Shimon ben Yochai. So Reb Shimon ben Yochai says to his students, what do you think? He says, what do you think? So they say, because the Jews, they benefited from the banquet of Osa Rosha of Achashverosh. Because they went to the banquet when they were told not to go, and they benefited from the food of that banquet. They participated in the celebration. So Reb Shimon ben Yochai says to his students, if that's the case, only the Jews in Shushan, the capital city, they should be held liable. But the Jews throughout the world, the decree was to annihilate every man, woman, and child. What was their level of liability? Why were they culpable? So Reb Shimon ben Yochai offers his reason. But let's understand the students. The reason why they deserve to be annihilated is because they benefited from Sudosa Shalosa Rosha, from this banquet of that Rosha, Achashverosh. Now, the Megillah tells us he waited to the 3rd year of his reign to celebrate his coronation. Person becomes a king. He celebrated immediately. Why did he wait 3 years? So the Gemara says, the prophet, when the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, it says, after 70 years you will return. So there was a king before Achashverosh, his name was Belshazzar. He was a Chaldean king. He made a calculation, the 70 years were up. God did not redeem the Jews. He immediately took out the vessels of the Beis HaMikdash, and he began drinking from them, and that night he was killed. So they realized that he miscalculated. The 70 years weren't up, and God did not forsake the Jewish people. He did not renege on his commitment. Achashverosh said, Belshazzar calculated and miscalculated. His calculate was incorrect. I will calculate, and my calculation, I will not make the mistake that he made. And he calculated it. And according to his calculation, the 70 years were up in the 3rd year of his reign. So in the 3rd year of his reign, now's the time to celebrate. To celebrate his installation, his coronation as king of the Persian Empire, including the Jews. And the Jews will be here forever. They're not going back. God reneged on his promise. What the prophet had said, God reneged. Okay? So in essence, what are you celebrating? You're celebrating the desecration of God's name. He is putting out to the world, the Jewish God reneged on his people. They're forsaken forever. Although he said he's bringing back after 70 years, he's not. So every Jew who partook of that banquet, what was he actually celebrating? That God reneged. How do you do it? God subjects. You celebrate a desecration of God's name. And the Gemara says, Achashverosh also miscalculated. The 70 years were not up. He also had overlooked something. And that's the reason why Vashti, that night at the banquet, that's why she was killed. He put her to death for that reason. Because again, the time was not yet up. So again, how do you participate in something which is a desecration of God's name? There are many things out there. We see things or remain silent. But the silence itself is a chil Hashem. There's a famous story. I say famous if you know the story. It's famous. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, Hashem Yinokem Domo. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, before the Holocaust, he was the Rosh Yeshiva. There was a small town in Lithuania. It was called Branovich. And he was here in the United States to raise money. 1938, 39. And he went back knowing that he'll probably not return, he'll be killed. He went back to Europe. He was killed in the Kovna fort. He was machine gunned by the Nazis. They took all the Jews in the fort and they killed them all, murdered them all. So Rabbi Chanan was in the United States and he had phenomenal impact, his presence, because in those years they didn't see people of this dimension of greatness, of holiness. And he spoke and he lectured and he wrote articles. And before the war, the voice of Orthodox Jewry was almost silent, because Orthodox Jews didn't have any financial standing. Conservative also were more than Orthodox, but the power was with the Reform movement. And Temple Emmanuel, that was the seat of power of Jewry. The wealthiest Jews in America were there, and there were two bankers who were Jews, Reformed Jews. One's name was Schiff, and one name was Warburg. And they had written an article in the paper, which was a chil Hashem, which was a desecration of God's name. They said certain things about Judaism, about the religion, and Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, he reads this and he hears it. He says he has to respond. He cannot remain silent. Cannot remain silent. So they said to him, but you realize, even though these people are Reformed Jews, even though they said things they shouldn't have said, but we are beneficiaries, as Orthodox Jews, we're beneficiaries of their philanthropy. They underwrite the hospitals, the orphanages, the soup kitchens, and we benefit from that. If you, being the leader of the Orthodox Jewry, go and write this article and they feel offended, they'll cut off the supply line. So we're going to suffer completely. He says, I cannot remain silent. I will respond. So he said, the people are insane. God created insane people. He says, why did God create insane people? What is the value of a person who's insane? See, he says, because a person who's insane will say things which are the truth, which a sane person will not say. But what the insane person says has to be said. Except no sane person, because of the consequences, ramifications, is afraid to say what has to be said. But the Meshugana, meaning the crazy one, he will say what has to be said. Rabbi Chanan says, I will be the insane person. To say what has to be said. But again, but why? Why was he so adamant? Because remaining silent would be a Chillul Hashem. After having such an affront against God, against Torah, against Judaism, how do you remain silent? How do you not say something? And that's why he responded, regardless of whatever those consequences will be. Doesn't make a difference. There's an expression, God runs the world. It's not Schiff, it's not Warburg, it's not any of these people. And therefore, whatever the outcome will be, that's what's going to be. If it has to be done, it's my obligation, I will do it. And if you do the right thing, ultimately, things are going to work out. But it's the same thing. Now the question is, Rashi addresses this based on the Midrash. The Torah traces the pedigree of Pinchas 2 generations. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. Now, who was Pinchas's grandfather on the maternal side? He was Yisro. Yisro initially was a pagan. He was a pagan priest. He was a Midianite. And Pinchas goes and kills Zimri, who was a prince of Israel. And they say, the one whose grandfather fattened calves for idolatry, he should be the one to kill Zimri, who was a prince of Israel. So the Torah goes and traces his lineage to Aaron as being the most special Jew in the history of the Jewish people. Aaron was the equivalent of his brother Moshe. So as a result of that, to show who Pinchas really was, we trace his lineage one generation further back, that he's, they say, Aaron, okay, now we understand why he killed the prince. Otherwise, you mean a man whose grandfather fattened calves for idolatry, he should kill a prince? So the question's obvious. A person's about to be run over by a bus, and a homeless person who's illiterate, who hasn't bathed in 6 years, goes and pulls that person away from the path of the bus and saves his life. Is he going to say to that person, where do you have the audacity to touch me and take me out from the path of the bus and save my life? Is there something wrong with you? Don't you realize the man just saved your life? Pinchas saved the day. God says if not for Pinchas' act of zealotry, the Jewish people would be annihilated. Not one surviving Jew. They say, where do you have the audacity? A man whose grandfather fattened calves for idolatry. Where do you have a right to kill the prince? But what was the value of killing that prince? There would have been a plague which would have consumed us all. So what is the basis for this claim? Right? It seems to be nonsense. It's foolishness. It's insanity. So the way to understand it, that's not what they were saying. You know, everybody, when something happens, there's always a question. Factually, it was a Chillul Hashem. There was a desecration of God's name at a level which was unheard of. The prince of Israel cohabiting publicly with a Midianite princess, and his whole tribe, many of them were also cohabiting. 24,000 of them died in this plague. How do we remain silent? How do you remain silent? There has to be an answer. Why did we react? After seeing Pinchas react, why didn't we react? Every one of us has to ask that question. There's a level of guilt, and it has to be responded to. A person can't live with guilt. Now, how do you respond? So what did they say? They say, there's certain societal perceptions and certain things a person can't do because there's certain things placed in society in terms of status that a person almost can't cross lines. Psychologically cannot cross lines. You're locked into a certain situation. Now, a person who's uneducated, doesn't even know what prestige, what status means, what value of a human being is. And they say, we want you to kill, God forbid, to assassinate the president. He doesn't even know what the word president means. He just took him out of the jungle. He comes from a cannibal tribe. You kill an animal, it's all the same to him. So he goes and kills the president. Without any compunction, without any hesitation. But a person who's civilized and cultured to some degree and has an understanding the different positions of power, and he has a certain representation, and a person's told that, there's no way I could do that. Not possible. So the question is this: why was Pinchas able to kill Zimri, and why didn't we? Very simple. You know what his pedigree is? He comes from a bunch of pagans. They bring human sacrifice. They do many things. Something for him to kill Zimri wasn't a great accomplishment. He didn't have much holdback. We come from a prestigious line. We're Jewish on both sides, from the maternal and paternal side. Therefore, we couldn't do it. That's the reason why. We couldn't do it. So the Torah traces his status back to Aaron. No. In prestigious pedigree, he's even more than Zimri. So it's a peer group. The reason why he can do it is because he's the peer group of Zimri. We're commoners. A commoner to go and approach a prince, that's not possible. So that the moment they're alleviated from their guilt, now they can see Pinchas in the positive light. They only put him in the negative light, not because of the act that he did. They only said he was able to do that because he's at a lesser level. So Hashem said, no, he's at a greater level. So now we understand. So again, they shirk the responsibility. They no longer live with the guilt. But the truth is, the reason why he killed Zimri was because he was a true zealot. Because at that moment, the pain was so searing and so all-consuming, he could not tolerate the desecration of God's name. But to be able to relate to that level, you have to be at that level. Otherwise, you don't understand that level. I'll give you an example how you're locked into certain patterns of behavior and certain status levels. Now, we read in prophets who killed Goliath. Goliath HaPelishti, King David. He was David. Right, he killed Goliath. Okay? And that took the wind out of the sails of the Pelishtim, and they defeated the Philistines as a result of this by killing the giant. David was on a hunting expedition, and mistakenly, accidentally, he roamed into Philistine territory. So they said to the people, we captured King David, and they bring him to the Philistine king, Avimelech. It's a psalm we say every Shabbos. And David HaMelech, King David, you know what he did? He said, it's King David. He conquered Israel. He was a human being we can't even fathom and understand who he was in terms of his capability and his dimension of being. His intelligence, his astuteness, his ability. And he starts behaving like a raving maniac. He puts on a show as if he's insane, like you've never seen an insane person. Foaming at the mouth, mucus coming out of his nose, his beard filthy. And he looks like a person who's out of an insane asylum that's such a patient they never had. So the king of the Philistines says, this is King David? Impossible. He may resemble him, but there's no way that this could be King David. They send him off. So I ask the question, if God forbid we should be caught in a predicament, and the only way we could save our lives, we have to behave and act like a raving, insane maniac, and to go and behave and allow ourselves to sink to this level. Do you think we could do it? Most people can't. In this generation, for sure not. During World War II, Jews fled from the Nazis in Warsaw or other cities. They had to go into the sewers, and they had to wade through human waste to save their lives. And they did it, and they stayed in the sewers. Do you think people in our generation who are so pampered and live on the level of hygiene, we have to shower 3 times a day, and if you don't buy a certain type of cologne or soap or skin moisturizer, you break out with a rash. Do you think you could wade it through human waste to save your life? I don't think so. We're so locked into our own self of who we are, we can't. David, as great as he was, the greatest, he could compromise every bit of his being. Why? Now, the Midrash tells us the 3 most humble people who ever lived. Moshe was the most humble. Avram Avinu, Abraham our patriarch, was the 7th most humble, and David was the 3rd. Why was Moshe the most humble? The Torah attests he's the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth. What did he say? Nachnu mo. What are we? What am I? Nothing. There was no trace of self. Avram Avinu said to God, Anochi ofav efer. I am dust, I am ash. Dust and ash, although it's worthless, is more than nothing. And what did David say? Anochi tolei v'lo. I'm a worm, I'm not a person. You're a worm. A worm is more than ash, because a worm is a living entity. It has life in it. Because David was so negated and so humble, the whole idea of who am I? What am I? There's no I. There's nearly no I. What do I have to do? I have to do what God wants. So there's no compromise of I. There's so much of the I. There's so much to compromise. It's not so simple to compromise it. And because we can't compromise it, therefore we can't behave, because acting that way, we're displaying a behavior which is so contrary to what the way we perceive ourselves, it's not possible. That's why we couldn't do it, and he could do it. And David, because he was so humble, the 3rd most humble person, therefore he could behave like this raving, maniac, lunatic, foaming at the mouth with mucus covering his face and beard, and acting in a way which is not to be believed how he acted. That was David. Just end, there's a word from Rabbi Simcha Dvinsk. Pinchas ben Elaz ben Aaron HaKohen. Very often, characteristics, they carry on from generation to generation in families. It's almost like there's a genetic pool, which, like the Gemara says, that Jews have a predisposition for certain behavior. Jews, vast majority of Jews, if they're original Jews, are Rachmanim. They have mercy, they have compassion. Why? Because since we come from Avram Avinu, this was innate in Avram and the patriarchs. We being their descendants, every Jew has that characteristic. We are Baishonim. Jews have conscience. There's no nation in the world that has a conscience like the Jewish conscience. And then we're Gomli Chasodim. We do acts of loving kindness. There's no people in the world per capita who are philanthropists, who give charity the way the Jewish people give charity. Why? Because Avram Avinu was the pillar of kindness, living loving kindness. Therefore, we being his descendants, we possess those characteristics. It's innate in our makeup. And if a Jew does not have these characteristics, it says you have to research his pedigree that he's not an original Jew. If he doesn't have these characteristics. That's how integral it is in terms of the profile of the essence of what a Jew is. But there are other things. You could have in certain families certain innate characteristics. We read that at the time when Moshe was in heaven receiving the Torah, the rabble, they instigate the golden calf. Miriam had a son by the name of Hur. And he immediately, this was Moshe and Aaron's nephew, he opposed them. And when he opposed them, he tried to stop it, they murdered him. The rabble killed him. They come to Aaron, they say, Aaron, we would like you, we believe Moshe died, we would like you to build us a golden calf. So he had a dilemma. So allow yourself to be killed. But he said, because Aaron was a prophet and he was a Kohen, if the Jewish people allow the Kohen and prophet to be killed, they will never be atoned. So he says, he will engage in putting it together, and hopefully it'll be a delay tactic, and by the time he's finished, Moshe would return. And they'll see there was no concern. And he told them to gather the gold, to this and that, and before he turned around, through witchcraft, sorcery, a gold calf came out. So what was his calculation to do what he did? Because he says, better I should be culpable for this, than the Jew should never be atoned. Never be atoned. The plague was ensuing. Pinchas comes out with the prince of Shimon, Zimri, and the princess, the Midianite princess, on this. And he's holding them. And the plague is ensuing. That means the attribute of justice is in full force. Jews are dying like flies. Pinchas, it says, Vayefalel, Posuk in Til, Vayefal Pinchas Elokim. Pinchas took God to task. He said, what's going on over here? Why are you just killing Jews? When you speak to God that way, it's not so simple. You're putting your whole existence in jeopardy. And he took both of them and slammed them to the ground. He says, look what I've done for you. That's what you're doing to your people. This is what he speaks to. Immediately the plague stopped. When Pinchas took that initiative, do you know what he did? He put his whole spiritual existence into jeopardy. He could have forfeited everything. You don't speak to God this way. But he said, for the sake of the Jewish people, that they should exist, I'm willing to put everything on the line. Where did he inherit that characteristic from? That characteristic he inherited from his grandfather. As Aaron himself was willing to put his whole spiritual existence on the line for the Jewish people, that they should be forgiven, regardless of his predicament, I'm willing to give it away only for them. Now, after Aaron passed away, the Torah tells us the clouds of glory dispersed and we were attacked. The Jews themselves, they said, we're going back to Egypt. We're going back to Egypt. And they went back many locations. Moshe says to Elazar was Pinchas' father, I want you to go after them, bring them back. The tribe of Levi was a handful of people relative to the rest of Jewish people. There were battles. Many families of Levi were killed. That means they're willing to put their life on the line for the sake of Kiddush Hashem. So there it was a question of giving up your physicality. Where did Pinchas have the level of sensitivity? I'm willing to give up my physicality, even put my life in jeopardy for the sake of the Jewish people. He did, as it says. If not for the miracle, he would have been killed. That he inherited from his father. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, the reason why he was able to function in all these capacities and be able to internalize to such a degree, both to forfeit the physical and the spiritual, is because he was the son of his father and the son of his grandfather.